Okay, hello. I just wanted to give a quick introduction to this video since it's pretty long. You may or may not want to watch it. I'm mostly making this for myself so that sometime in the future I can look back and see what I was doing at the moment. So this started a little over a year ago. I started drawing again because I had lots of time on my hands. And when I was a kid, I used to love to draw. And though I did get some encouragement, I got very little actual sort of anyone who could help me to do better. And so I got frustrated and gave up. So now that I have a lot of time, I thought, hey, I can try to learn. And since I'm an adult, I can sort of support myself a little bit better than I was able to be supported back then. And after a while, I realized, hey, I can draw Calvin and Hobbes. I used to like to draw cartoons, but Calvin and Hobbes came around after I had given up on drawing, so I never really tried to draw them. So one day I took out an old Calvin and Hobbes book, tried to draw a few cartoons, decided I could do it, and then it got the idea that I would redraw the entire first treasury, which is about a year and a half of cartoons. So I started doing that. I've been doing that for over a year now. I'm up to page, in this particular video, up to page 162 out of 256. So what I'm going to show you in this video, or remind myself, is how I went about drawing the cartoon. So I'm going to be, in this video, showing you a time-lapse version of how I drew this particular page, which in the end took me about 9 hours, but hopefully this video will be a little bit shorter. Right, so in this video I show my basic workflow, which includes how do I draw the borders of the various panels, how do I set up the text. At first it was a real struggle to sort of try to get it in the right place and so forth, so I found out some tricks so that wasn't really what I was using all my time on. I also had to deal with the fact that when I was drawing I couldn't really draw a whole page at a time. I could only really do one strip at a time. So in Sunday pages, I break it into 4 different strips. On a weekday page, it's only 3. But basically, I take a photograph with my iPhone, send it over to my iPad, open it into the Photos app, and then duplicate the photo for as many rows as there are. So here you can see I've made 4 copies of the photograph. And then I use the tools within the photos to sort of resize each of those copies of the page to just have a single row. There's the first row, and then I resize to get the second row, and of course I'm going to do the same with the third and the fourth row right after that. So I'm going to go through that fairly quickly. It's kind of boring watching it. Then what I do is I go out of the Photos app and I open up Photoshop. Then I'll create a new document. I've come up with a size that's basically twice the height of the row plus a little bit of extra space. I change the opacity to just 90% so that I can see through the panel that I have here that's white. I'll pull in a row, resize it so that it fits the width, depends on the size of the photograph I took, and then duplicate that row on the bottom, and basically I'll use the bottom copy as a guidelines. I don't actually trace, we'll see that a little bit later, but I do use the guidelines to help figure out where I'm going to put the panel lines and where the text is going to end up and so forth. So once I have that all set up, I export it as a new image, and then I repeat the process with the other 2 rows. So let's run through that really quickly. And then I'll show you how I add in these panel lines so that they're basically the right size. Sadly, Photoshop doesn't have a nice ruler, and to make these straight lines it's kind of useful to have a ruler. The Photos app, if you use the Apple Pencil or just the notation stuff, you can actually get a ruler. So here you can see I can set the ruler at 90 degrees, and that will guide my drawing the lines. So draw the line for the left side, then draw a line for the right side. It takes a little bit of effort to get the ruler lined up properly. And you can see that I'm using the fact that I've got this very sort of under tracing paper version. I can use the the regular pen to get the lines. I use the eraser to get rid of that little extra that I left purposefully there. So here I'm drawing the bottom line, and then I'll erase those little extra stuff. Once I've got the ruler set up right, now I'm all set with that one, and I can go on and do the others. I do wish I could do it this fast for real, but I'm just speeding up my video. This always takes a little bit of time, so just doing this part of the setup usually takes me about 10 minutes to get the page set up, at least with these panel lines drawn around each of the different panels. So now I've finished that, and then the next step, the rest of it is going to be done in Photoshop. I will start by importing one at a time each of those images with the panel lines. And here I'm going to use Photoshop's layers to essentially set up more guidelines, mostly for the text, although I also set up some guidelines for where the actual cartoons are going to appear in the panels sometimes. But first you see that I'm essentially creating a duplicate that has a white background, and I'm getting just the actual panel without anything in it. And then I will make essentially 3 copies of the layer that just has the panel. And I'll use those. I'll have one for drawing all of the text, the black and white portion of the image and so forth. I'll have one for doing the color. And then I'll also have a layer that essentially just gives guidelines for where the text should go. So what you're seeing right now is that I'm editing the layer that's going to have the guidelines for the text. And what I basically do is I go in and I look at where I have text and I draw in these guidelines so I know where to draw it. It's a cheat, I admit. I'm sure that Bill Watterson would just put in the text without having to have guidelines. But hey, I'm learning, and so it's okay. I've told my younger self who's doing the drawing, my older self is saying, hey, sometimes in order to learn, you give yourself some guidelines. Don't worry about it. So here you can see I'm just putting in the guidelines for the Calvin and Hobbes heading, and then I'm putting in guidelines for where the text for this little voice bubble is going in, and I will give myself some guidelines for the bubble itself without drawing the actual bubble, but I'll just see where the edges are. And again, before I did this, I ended up spending lots of time just trying to figure out where the bubble was, and if I got it wrong, then I couldn't actually do the drawing well. And since what I'm really trying to do is give myself an ending that I want to get to, more or less where it's going to be, but not actually tracing. So now you see what that actually looks like, and that's what I'm going to be using to draw. But I don't want to draw on the guidelines, so I lock that layer, and then I go ahead and do my drawing above it. So now you can see I'm going to continue doing the same thing with the rest of the page. This part usually takes me for the page, depending on how much text it has, about a half-hour total, doing all the setup with the lines and specifying where the bubbles are and the text is and so forth. Now I've got the whole page set up, so I go back, and then the first thing I do is I do all the text, usually for the whole page. And I do that in one go. So here I'm going to get started. I'll start drawing in the Calvin and Hobbes logo, and I'll give you a few seconds of the actual time it takes me to do this, because it is pretty slow, but I will speed it up in just a second. Okay, yeah, that's a little better. This is actually one of the reasons why I wanted to do these videos, is to actually see my strokes at a speed that feels better. So now we're going to see in a moment one of the only things that I do that is actually my attempt to be somewhat unique, but still inspired by Bill Watterson, and that's my signature here. So I've tried a lot of different ways to do my signature, and I tried to make it inspired by the way I saw Bill Watterson doing his signature. So You can decide what you think of it, but I kind of like where I've come up with there, where the bottom line for the E and the L and the L and the E all sort of blend together, and then the R and the S and the E sort of get squinched up. It's a little bit like how he does the T, the tops of the T's become one line in his signature. So now what I did at the end there was I hid the guidelines. So now that I've drawn the text, those guidelines disappear, and everything else I do, it doesn't have any guidelines. Sometimes I've added little guidelines to the edges just so that I know, for example, there's some little guidelines there at the bottom or things like that, so that I can figure out more or less where I'm going to be drawing, either the edge of the tree or the rake in the first one or so forth. I love the way Bill does lettering, and I'm still not there yet. It's actually quite difficult to do lettering, I've discovered, which surprised me a bit, but hey, that's one of the reasons why I'm doing it, is to see what I can learn and just have fun with doing it. So here we can see all the letters going in. When I'm doing this, most of the time when I'm drawing, I'm able to listen to audiobooks or so forth, but when I'm doing the lettering, I can't help but read it, and so then I end up not paying attention to what I'm listening to. So I generally do the lettering part with nothing going on in the background. And usually lettering for the entire page also takes maybe about 20 minutes to a half hour per row, depending on, again, how much normal lettering there is. Like this lettering, you can see it goes a lot faster, but when there's big lettering like crunch and all that sort of stuff, that takes me long. So here's an example of that. With this lettering, you can see I have to be a little bit more careful to sort of try and figure out where things are going to go. Small letters, I can just zoom right along. These look like they're going fast, but believe me, this is sped up. So, and then you can see I've got a lot of the little guidelines down at the bottom. There's my signature again. And then we have some more text. Generally, when I'm working, I have to have the original on top so that I can see it, so I know what I'm drawing. And I'm spending a lot of time looking at both what I'm drawing and the original up above. So that's why the image sort of jumps around a little bit as I try to get each in view. Okay, so now I'm done with all the text for the whole page, and I start drawing, and I'm going to draw, again, starting from the first top row, going through all of them, doing one panel at a time. At this point, I've probably spent about 2.5 hours, half-hour drawing, or setting up the page, then a half hour each row drawing the text. And then it usually takes me, depending on how complex things are, anywhere between a half hour to an hour and a half per panel to draw the actual black and white version of the comic. So this one looks fairly simple, but because it's just Calvin's mom standing there wondering where the pillows have gone. But I struggle with it, as you can see. So I'm working through building up her. Now, one of the things that when you learn how to draw, they often tell you is that you make sort of a wireframe first. For some reason, there's a part of me that really just wants to draw more or less as I see it. So if you're watching this and you have any drawing skills or any education or just know how people should be doing this, you might be thinking you're going about this all the wrong way. And maybe you're right, but this is the way I want to draw it, and so I'm going to let myself draw it the way that I want to for now, because I'm just doing this for fun, and I may eventually learn to do it right. But what I'm doing, you can see for the most part, I'm using the Apple Pencil as if it were a pencil. I don't use a lot of the features in Photoshop that could help me. I do use the autofill sometimes, this little paint bucket, so that if I've got an area that needs to be all black, I can just drop in a bunch of black. I sometimes use the lasso, which allows me to sort of move around something if I put it in the wrong place, but the lines are more or less okay, like I just did there. But for the most part, I just try to use Photoshop as if it were a pencil and paper. Now, when I have finished a drawing, I will use the lasso sometimes just to compare what I did with the original to give myself a sense of, okay, what am I doing wrong here? I won't correct it usually. I'll just get a sense that, okay, I maybe made her hands a little bit off, or the elbow is a little bit too far down, and you can see there. So I made her head a little bit too far away. So then I'll just leave what I did and take that as a lesson. Okay, so I'm going to speed up the video a little bit. So I am really going, the video is going a lot faster than I can draw, but at least you're getting a sense of what it's like. You've been patient enough as it is to watch as much as I've been doing, and this stuff really does take me a long time. So I love seeing how it comes in going at this speed, though. It makes it really feel like I know what I'm doing, which I don't. I think Hobbes is always really difficult to draw all of his stripes, although in some sense having those stripes and Calvin having stripes in his t-shirt and so forth, that kind of helps to put the various proportions, and certainly giving me lots of practice of trying to get things in the right place. I always struggle with Calvin's hair, trying to get that in the right proportions and so forth. Things like trees, I really love the way Bill Watterson draws trees and leaves and all that sort of stuff. They tend to be easier because it's not so obvious in the end result when you just look at it that what I did is different than what he did. I think you can sort of see it here, but it doesn't look too bad. Whereas Calvin and Hobbes, or Calvin's parents, or other characters, you really can see the human mind works so that it sees differences in faces and stuff like that. So I feel like even the cans, I feel like I can see that the lips of Calvin's mouth are really subtle in the way that they curve, and it's really difficult for me to get something that I think is similar to what Bill Watterson has captured. Something like this where there's lots of leaves. I think it's interesting to learn to really understand how he's giving the sense of this whole pile of leaves, even though he only draws leaves along the edges, and he leaves a big open space. When I get to coloring, you'll see how I managed to try to capture the same colors he has, but I think he does a great job at the colors and using different colors for backgrounds. He was sending his stuff out in newspapers, so he had to use the standard colors that they had available. I understand that if you go to a museum that has all his original stuff, the actual drawings he did were even more impressive than what ended up being in the newspapers. I like how he does this where he has different arms and so forth to show fast movement. So he's got multiple arms or multiple sleeves and multiple hands and stuff like that, coming out to show that Calvin's really jumping around at this point. The leaves in the air, I love all that stuff. So Hobbes here is, again, when I look at what I'm doing, of course, is looking at the original and trying to recreate it. What I sort of hope at some point is that that's going to help me if I have an idea of what I want to draw myself, be able to compare what I'm drawing to whatever I have in my mind's eye. We'll see if I ever get to that point. But I'm really surprised often to see when I compare my drawing to the actual drawing, as I did earlier with the lasso, or I'll show you at the end of this, comparing the full page that I drew to the full page that Bill drew. It's really interesting to see how far there is a shift, and in some sense that changes the the expression that the characters have and so forth. Now we're almost done with the black and white version of the page, so now we go into coloring. To do the coloring, I need to sort of pick the color from the original, which I can get from up above, but you'll notice that the white background of the color isn't actually white, it's pretty grayish. So that means that affects the colors themselves, so I can't just pick them and use them. I have to pick them and then adjust them a little bit using my eye to try and get them as close to the original idea as I can, because it's not going to be, I'm not going to be able to use the exact original color. But at this point, basically, I've created my own Calvin and Hobbes coloring book, and so I'm able to sort of fill in the colors however I like. I try to get them close, and sometimes mine are a little bit off, I can see, but maybe I'm just lazy. I'll let them be as close as I can get them. Usually the coloring part takes about a half hour per row, so almost 2 hours for a Sunday strip is pretty common for when I'm doing the drawing. Skin tones tend to be really difficult to get right, and so I might spend a lot of time on those. I've gotten a lot better at using the color picker in Photoshop, in adjusting and so forth. So here we're starting to get close to the end of this page, only one more row to go. I'll start that, coloring that in a second. The letters tend to be a little bit difficult to color in, but since we've got everything sped up, you don't have to see it. You don't have to suffer as much as I did for my art. But you've been very patient. We're already 21 minutes into this. I'm about 9 hours in at this point, just finishing up on the whole drawing. And then when I'm done, what I'll do is I take all the individual rows, put them into a document, so I can see a whole page at a time. So in just a second, we'll drop off and I'll show you the whole final finished page as I did it. Then we'll see the original again. So there's my final page, and we'll transition over to the original and then transition back to mine, and you can sort of use your controls to go back and forth if you want to compare the two. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it.